And welcome back, fellow football fanatics. This is College Football with Sam. My apologies for the streaming issues. I know that there were a few streams that popped up. I had some issues for whatever reason getting the studio set up, but we're live here and now. And I have several games to talk about with you on this show. And then tomorrow and later tonight, there will be some shorter previews, the 5-minute previews for some smaller games, but I wanted to do the major games today, and I wanted to kick this off really with Clemson versus Georgia Tech, Oregon versus Northwestern, and then really get into it. Make sure, if you haven't already, to subscribe, like the video. I really appreciate your interaction, your comments, your feedback. Make sure to sign up as a new member if you haven't already. That way you can get access to some bonus content and members-only live shows that will be starting next week. Details on that will be released in the coming days. I'd say the next 48 hours, at least by Sunday. And also hit the notification bell. That way you can get notified when we go live, notified when we talk about different games. It's been a little bit longer than I thought and then I wanted to get to all these games, but I think that Week 3 is going to be a very underrated week, and I'm going to tell you why. And I think a great way to explain the epitome of why Week 3 is going to be great is to talk about Clemson and Georgia Tech. I think this is the centerpiece game, the cornerstone game of Week 3. I think it is going to be one of the better games of Week 3. There are technically bigger games like Georgia-Tennessee, top 15 matchup. Per power ratings, it's a top 10 matchup. Texas A&M Notre Dame by rankings is more impactful. And look, these are two ACC teams. Per power ratings, they're not all that great. Clemson is probably being underrated per FPI. Tech is probably properly rated there. There's a reason why per FPI Georgia Tech should be favored, but the books have Clemson favored by over 3.5 points. I think Clemson is the better team. And yet, this should be a close game. Clemson hasn't looked all that good. I've said for months that I think Georgia Tech is a playoff sleeper. National title contender, no. But then again, through 2 weeks, I don't quite know if Clemson is either. So let's get right to it, shall we? Clemson, Georgia Tech. Clemson, Georgia Tech. Kickoff at noon Eastern time this Saturday. Clemson being a 3.5 point favorite. We're bringing out the glasses for this show because I think we got to look at some of these games rather closely. Week 3 is once again being slated as this very weak, down low weekend, and I couldn't disagree with that more, if I'm being honest. I think this is a much stronger slate of games than what we had in Week 2. We have a noon game. This is the one we're talking about today. We have a noon game in Clemson, Georgia Tech that I think is very impactful to the playoff race, impactful to both of these programs. This is a potential program win for Georgia Tech, and I'd also say it could be a program win or loss for Clemson. Clemson has a lot to lose in this game. Going to be 76 degrees Fahrenheit at kickoff, about 5 miles per hour. Clemson has that precious 3.5 number. That makes me confident here that the books view Clemson as the better team, or at least they think that Clemson should be the better team. But does that mean they are the better team? Well, I want to explore that here. Look at that concept and dive into it, because whether or not Clemson actually is the better team than Georgia Tech would definitely determine this game, because I believe that Tech has some matchup advantages here over Clemson in addition to home field advantage. So I want to get to those and show that when you look at it here through 2 weeks, now I know that Tech has not played LSU at home. I know their second game's been against Gardner-Webb. They've played an easier strength of schedule. They have. But when you look at how these teams have played so far, Clemson's playing much closer to Georgia Tech's talent level, objectively watching how their players are blocking, missing assignments, or straight up being overpowered, especially on the offensive line. Clemson has really struggled to run the football. Klubnik is looking a little bit rusty. In fact, a little bit's putting it rather kindly. He's looked rusty, and that's shocking. I'm someone who thought he would win the Heisman. It would kind of be a slam dunk pick to win the Heisman, because even if he struggled against LSU, your schedule's one of the easiest in terms of all the preseason national title contenders. It's even easier than Oregon's or Penn State's, and their schedules are pretty easy compared to, say, Georgia's. I think they're probably easier than Ohio State's because they never played at Texas in the non-conference, even though Ohio State got them at home. You get the picture. Probably easier than an Alabama schedule. We could go on and on and on. Easier than LSU's schedule, I would certainly say. Easier than Texas's. It was the easiest schedule out of all the preseason national title favorites. Easier than Notre Dame's schedule. I'd argue it. I don't know if it's easier than Miami's, but I don't know if Miami was viewed by many as a preseason national title contender. And yet right now, Clemson has not lived up to that in the preseason. When you, through 2 games, have a points per play margin of 0.080, which means that you're only scoring that many more points per one of your plays than one of your opponent's plays, and one of your opponents is Troy, and the other is LSU, and LSU is not right now viewed as one of the top 5 national title contenders per the books, and especially not per ESPN's FPI, you probably have some issues. Even those who are very high on Clemson, my friend at Bald Father Bets, who runs a wonderful channel, you should check him out. Very intelligent, very insightful. He's taught me a lot, and his channel should have tens of thousands of subscribers, not a few hundred. So go over and help him reach that goal. Even he will admit, and he's very high on Clemson, even he will admit they have not looked good through 2 weeks. They have some things to clean up. Georgia Tech, I'm not saying they're perfect here, but Georgia Tech can run the football. Georgia Tech, if Haynes King is healthy, can put together a functional offense with a balanced attack. Georgia Tech has Eric Rivers, Dean Patterson, and Malik Rutherford, so they have receivers. Clemson has Bryant Wesco, TJ Moore, Antonio Williams. We know about Clemson's receivers. Georgia Tech's receivers are not as well known, and they are some of the better receivers nationally. When you look at scoring offense, Clemson has a 0.319 points per play offensively. That's worse than Michigan's. Michigan scores more points per play on offense than Clemson does. A lot of that has to do with play style. Michigan doesn't execute. They don't call as many plays per game. Clemson doesn't really fit the modern offensive meta of trying to slow down games, load manage, and establish game control. They still like on offense to use tempo and run as many plays as they can, at least for an offense of their talent level. Most offenses that are of Clemson's talent level call a slower game than Clemson does, and I think sometimes that goes to their detriment. Sometimes it underrates their offense in the advanced metrics, because if you run more plays, you usually aren't going to be as efficient with those plays unless you have a ridiculously insane generational, if not centennial offense, and Clemson doesn't have that. But in watching their game against Troy pretty closely, watching that entire LSU game, they clearly have issues offensively in a way that if Georgia Tech is healthy and they're not turning it over every other time like they were against Colorado, I don't know if Tech has quite that floor that we've seen from some of the quarters of football Clemson has played in. Both defenses, Clemson's defense is obviously better, and we'll talk about that throughout this segment, but I think Georgia Tech has some players on defense that need to be known as well. Per FPI, they're both 9.2 points better than the average team in college football. The books disagree with this. They'd probably have Clemson favored by 6.5, 7, 7.5 neutral field. That's why that line is at 3.5 right there. But look, I think that both of these teams are much closer together right now than many expected in the preseason. And many who believed in Tech in the preseason, I think also believed in Clemson. And I think that the reason some people are picking Georgia Tech to outright win here, or that there is that feeling, or the reason FPI is favoring Tech in this game, is telling us more about the reaction to Clemson than what we know about Georgia Tech. I think that through 2 weeks and the nature of Clemson having more returning production and more talent, more known players, I think that this is saying more about Clemson than Georgia Tech. I think we know more about Clemson to this degree than Georgia Tech. Doesn't mean that Clemson can't improve, but I've said in my reaction video to Troy and Clemson that I am beginning to be skeptical of Clemson being a national title contender. Still believe in them strongly as an ACC contender. They should expect to win the ACC. I think it's still a race between them and Miami. But Georgia Tech may have something to say about that. And Georgia Tech, in addition to having Haynes King at quarterback, in addition to having excellent wide receivers, I also think the Yellow Jackets have, quite the offensive line. And I also think that, look, they have quite the defensive line too. I love what Georgia Tech has on their roster. I think that this early in the year, I don't know if the status of Haynes King, don't know if he's going to be fully healthy for this game, but Ethan McKinney, Harrison Moore, Keelan Rutledge, Malachi Carney on the offensive line, and then you have Akello Stone, Jordan Vandenberg in that nose tackle, D-tackle spot, the defensive tackle room. Tech's interior trench play and then their tackles on offense are some very impressive players, exceptional players. And then for Clemson, we know about, TJ Parker, DeMonte Capehart, Peter Woods, Will Helt, wonderful D-line, an O-line that has Blake Miller, Tristan Lay. We already know about the receivers and Cade Klubnik. I will say, I'm pretty concerned about how this matchup could go in the trenches. I am somewhat concerned about that. We'll see where this game ends up going, but I would be concerned if I were a Clemson fan about the trenches. What I'd be concerned about if I were a Tech fan is whether or not my quarterback is going to be healthy. Georgia Tech has good enough players in the trenches where I think that they can stalwart a Clemson offensive line and a Clemson rushing attack that admittedly has struggled quite a bit. With Clemson, it's important here that either Klubnik is on time or he's accurate and he's, doing the right things. He's playing a better game than he has in the first 2 weeks where he's been off, to put it kindly. Or if he isn't on time, if he once again is having a week full of struggles, you need to find a way to run the ball, or you need to pray that Haynes King is not in this game, or you need to force turnovers like Colorado did and then capitalize on them just enough to eke out with a win. King being healthy, I think, is the biggest question for Georgia Tech by a mile. If King is healthy, I think that Tech should actually be favored in this game. If he is hurt, then Clemson should be favored by probably more than 3.5 points. I do truly think that King is that valuable of a player here. That's what I think. Looking at the different type of styles, Tech likes to slow things down. Clemson likes to speed things up. They like to, maximize their talent advantage. Georgia Tech likes to minimize their talent disadvantage. That's why they run the offenses that they do. I think a big part of the reason why. Georgia Tech with King, you have Jamal Haynes, then you have the O-line that we talked about. You have the receivers that can keep the defense honest, and then you have a quarterback that can really run a option offense to perfection. Add that element. Not that Tech runs an option offense. It's a power spread. It's inspired by what Todd Monken ran at Georgia. Buster Faulkner, Georgia Tech's OC, worked under him, brought many of those concepts to the Yellow Jackets. But with King, they can really do almost anything if he's healthy and playing a good game. So the contrast of styles is important. The different QB situations are very important. Defensive line play could very well decide this game. Trench play always does, but I mainly want to focus on D-line play and also run blocking. I think that Tech's offensive line is good enough to protect King if healthy, and King's also, aware enough and athletic enough and good enough of a QB to where if he's healthy, he can find ways to escape the pocket or make a positive play out of nothing. It's similar with Klubnik, especially considering I don't think Tech has the talent on the defensive front that LSU did, to where they completely, almost completely shut Klubnik down. And I also think Klubnik has played flukishly bad through 2 games in a way that if this continues, he definitely regress from where he was last year, and I don't think that's going to happen. I almost think that's not possible. So I think more likely than not, he's due for a rebound here at some point, and we have to factor that in. Last but not least, we have 2 good QBs at the worst, 2 elite QBs if they play to their potential, and we have amazing wide receiver cores. And we have secondaries that have some players who are a little iffy. I don't think anyone's saying that Georgia Tech has elite receivers. I don't think anyone exactly is going to say that. Or not elite receivers, my bad. I don't think anyone is going to be saying here that Georgia Tech has elite defensive backs. Rodney Shelley, Afmari Harvey. I think Harvey's pretty good. Clayton Powell-Lee, Omar Daniels, Jai Gilmore. It's an old DB group. All of them are seniors. I think they do run a good operation. But Clemson theoretically should have a talent advantage here. And that is going to mean a lot. But Clemson, I think the Tigers at secondary also have some things that they have to deal with and some weaknesses. Avion Terrell and Ashton Hampton graded out pretty highly last year at corner, but Terrell's been highly penalized, and their safeties in nickel, Khalil Barnes, Ricardo Jones, Ronan Hannafin, Misson Kelly, or maybe it's Meeson Kelly. I hope I didn't mispronounce that name too badly. They're not as good. They're not as talented as the corners are. I think Tom Allen runs a wonderful defense. I genuinely believe that. But look, Georgia Tech also has a really good offense, and I don't think Clemson has the type of defense yet that Ohio State, Texas, Penn State, and Georgia do. I don't think that they are quite there. Some other things to consider in this game as I lean into my pick here, I would say are teams, and I would say coaching. I am going to come and pick Georgia Tech to beat Clemson, and the reason I'm going to do that mainly has to do with coaching. Also, on the standpoint of special teams, neither of these special teams units are exactly known to be special. That's not their forte here. But Tech's forte has been their coaching. That's been their forte. Brent Key beats ranked teams at home. Last year he beat Miami. He also nearly beat Georgia on the road, ranked opponent. The year before that, he also beat Miami on the road. And I forget. They beat North Carolina when North Carolina was ranked in 2023. And look, last year they went, 7-5, lost to Vanderbilt in the bowl game, but they had impressive performances like that game against Miami, or how they were able to beat Florida State at the beginning of the year. Florida State ended up being pretty bad, but they punch above their weight class. Clemson hasn't punched with their weight class in years, and it doesn't look like they're that much different this year. I think Georgia Tech wins, and I think they cover that 3.5-point line, and I ultimately think that, look, their consistency is going to win them this football game. The fact that they have an identity, and I don't quite know what Clemson's identity is. I know what they want to do. We've seen this before with Garrett Riley at TCU and his first 2 years at Clemson. They want to be able to run the football. They want to be explosive. And they just haven't shown much of that this year. Last year, they didn't show any of that really at all against big-time opponents outside of the Texas game, where they were able to have some success against Texas defensive backs more than any other passing offense in the playoffs that Texas faced, Arizona State, and surprisingly, Ohio State. But I think that Clemson has advantages through the air here, at least theoretically, and some of this is factoring in my expectation that Klubnik will bounce back, and I don't exactly know what King's health is. Clemson should be able to beat Tech's secondary more often than Tech's secondary beats their receivers or the DNs beat the tackles to get to the QB. And I think that Clemson's pass defense and pass rush should do a pretty good job limiting Tech's passing offense, but they aren't dominant there. I don't think that Clemson's passing attack or defense is a dominant strategy over Tech's pass defense or offense. I do, however, think that with Akello Stone and Jordan Vandenberg and Kyle Eford, I do not think that Adam Randall and then Ryan Lithincum, Colin Sadler, Walker Parks, and Cade Klubnik, I don't think that Clemson is going to have a lot of success running the ball here. I don't think so at all. I think that Clemson will be one-dimensional in this game. It will all be about Clemson's defense. No duh. It's one of the better defenses in the world in college football. But I also think that, Klubnik so far, he's had what? I think 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. He's averaging 213 passing yards per game. The reason he threw that pick 6 against Troy was not really on him. It was on his offensive line. They just don't, there's something about them that's off. And I don't know what it is. Don't know why it is. I could not fix that problem. I don't make enough money, nor am smart enough to do so. But I can tell you that they have problems that I think are a nightmare to try and work around against a team like Georgia Tech, provided King is healthy, provided that. I also think that Georgia Tech, their staff overall is probably equal with Clemson. Their talent isn't, but I think their staff is up there with Clemson's. And if you want to really place an emphasis on game management, which is what matters here, and an emphasis on the head coach, I think that Brent Key right now is a better head coach than Dabo Swinney. I do. I think at the end of the day, that's going to be a big reason why Georgia Tech wins here and why they cover that 3.5-point line. Okay. We can now move on to Florida versus LSU. Just before that, I want to make sure I time myself appropriately. So I'm going to go get my phone. I'll be right back. And we're back. Just need to make sure I can time myself, and I can't really do that all that effectively with my cell phone. I can only have so many tabs open on this computer. I probably need, with how much I want to run, a better computer. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about football. And Florida versus LSU is a big narrative game. What do I mean by Florida versus LSU is a big narrative game? What do I mean by that? What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by Florida and LSU being a big narrative game is the very simple reason that it's a rivalry game. Both of these coaches are under pressure for different reasons. Billy Napier's obviously on the hot seat. I think at the end of this year, there's a very good chance he gets fired. Win this game, it's a different conversation, but they're 7.5-point underdogs for a reason. They are. They're 7.5-point underdogs for a reason. Wait, what's going on here? There's something that is wrong. Hold on, guys. Hold on. Gotta fix something here. It's my bad. That is so weird. Why did I do that? This is why ideally I need a producer. Or I just need to make these so far in advance that I can double check them before I go live, but I was rushed today. It's my bad. Okay, there we are. Now we're ready. Now we can talk about these different things. Also don't know why my CPU is acting up. It's not like there's anything operating in the background. So I don't know what's What's up with some of this? It's weird. Oh well. Let me see. Maybe it's... Yeah, okay. I think I see... I think I see what's going on here. I think it's just the different tabs that are open using all the memory. Okay. Yeah. I think that's... Yep. That should help with things, I do believe. All right, let's oh, there it goes again. I'm lagging again. That's not good. What's going on? Oh boy. I think I know what's wrong, but I think I'd have to I think I'd have to stop the stream to change it, and I don't think the lag is noticeable enough. So we'll just power through this. Sorry about that, guys. Florida versus LSU. It's the primetime game of Week 3. Takes place at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Should be about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 4-mile-per-hour winds at kickoff in Death Valley, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. LSU is a 7.5-point favorite, and let me tell you, this is a narrative game. And I call it a narrative game because right now Florida is viewed as a bad team, a poorly coached team, a poverty program. Their head coach is on the hot seat. LSU is still coming off high from that win over Clemson in Week 1. I know they didn't have a good performance against Louisiana Tech, but from what I could tell in that game, I think they were playing a little bit bored. I think they were kind of load managing, treating that game for what it was, a game that LSU was never really going to lose. Still doesn't mean it was an encouraging performance, but I digress. The point I'm trying to make here is that this can get ugly for any team. The result will be ugly for any team. If Florida wins this game, everything good from Week 1 can be thrown into the trash for LSU. Because if you lose to Florida at home, you are not winning at all. You probably won't even be competing for the national title realistically. Maybe you'll still get in the playoffs, but based on how Florida looked in Week 2, this is a game that is about survival for the Gators. The Gators are no longer chasing playoff hopes here. You're not doing that if you lose to USF, and this isn't like Notre Dame last year, where Notre Dame had a better roster, better coordinators, they were better coached, they had an easier schedule, much easier schedule to get through than Florida does right now. So if Florida wins this game, it's not like Florida's going to finish 11-1, 10-2, 9-3, and it will just be a quality loss at home in a rivalry matchup. It would get ugly for LSU. On the flip side, if Florida loses, you drop to 1-2, and you were preseason unanimous top 15. And if you lose this game, especially if LSU doesn't play all that well in the process of beating the Gators, then DJ Lagway probably has another subpar game, and that doesn't reflect well on Napier's coaching or development. Since he's more of an offensive guy, he has, or had at least, I don't know about after Week 2, but he had a good reputation for being an offensive play caller and an offensive mind. Let's dive into what these teams are, what they've shown us so far this season. So, points per play margin. It's a stat that I love to bring up. This early, it fluctuates, but it can still tell a story with context. Later in the year, it does a pretty good job of actually predicting who the national champion is going to be. The leader in points per play margin entering the playoffs, or at least entering the national title game, really the leader at the end of November, in December, the month of December, usually ends up being the national champion. Usually. Not always, but so far, I think ever since 2019, or maybe it extends before that, every year in the 2020s, the team that finishes number one in points per play margin is also usually A, number one in power ratings, and B, they're the national champion. In fact, they've always been number one in power ratings, the team that finishes number one in points per play margin since 2020. They've always been number one at the end of the year. Florida has a negative points per play margin. That's because this statistic that I use doesn't count games against FCS teams. And I actually like that. Look, if we did that, then last year's Oregon team would have been underrated, and Auburn and Ole Miss would have been a little bit overrated, to be fair. And especially in the new era of college football, where you can lose to bad opponents and get in because it's a 12-team playoff. You need 12 teams to cram in there, soon to be probably 16. You can load manage. You can afford to treat some games not so seriously, and you don't deserve to be penalized for that. And the perfect games to be unserious in are the games against FCS opponents. So I'm sorry, but Florida's game against LIU shouldn't really reward them anything. Like, okay, you won 55-0. You should win 55-0 against LIU. And if you didn't, or you won by more, that doesn't really matter all that much. Your game against USF matters more. Your game against LSU and Miami matter even more than that. And against USF, Florida was outperformed on a play-per-play basis in terms of scoring points. Part of that was the safety. Part of that was the busted play for a touchdown. But the fact they were even in that position was painful. It was bad. The fact that Florida, look, I'm not going to rant because this is an LSU Florida preview, but it was very bad. This is a must-have game for Florida here against LSU. And LSU themselves has a points per play margin through two games of 0.121. They have not looked particularly impressive overall. They looked very impressive, I think, against Clemson. But now that we got a second sample size or a second sample and expanded our sample size, doubled it, and Clemson struggled against Troy, LSU struggled against Louisiana Tech, it's understandable to ask the question, how impressive was LSU's win over Clemson in the grand scheme of things? I can't wait to figure out that answer as the season goes on. Both of these defenses, I'd say to this point, are better than both offenses. I think that Blake Baker's done a fantastic job defensively with LSU, helping them evolve from year one to year two. Florida's defense was not really the reason they lost to USF. When you have that much talent on offense and can't do anything with it, we found the reason why you didn't win. Power ratings-wise, LSU is a 13.4. They have a 13.4 rating, which means they're about 2 touchdowns better than the average college football team, which is ranked as a 0. UF has an 11.9 power rating. So by power ratings, they'd still be top 25, but not top 20. And if the trends continue, they will finish outside of the top 25 for sure, even with Caleb Banks, even with Tyreek Sapp on the D-line, even with Jake Slaughter and Harris on the offensive line and DJ Lagway at quarterback. They could not beat USF, who is a 17.5-point underdog to Miami. As for LSU, Garrett Nussmeier has looked impressive. I like their wide receiver group. Got Berrien Brown, Aaron Anderson, Nick Anderson. At linebacker, Weeks and Harold Perkins have looked really good. I like how they're currently using Harold Perkins in that defense. But they still struggle to run the ball. Clemson had more TFLs than LSU did in that matchup. Yes, LSU won the rushing attack, but they didn't average more than 4 yards per carry. And against Louisiana Tech, they once again averaged fewer than 4 yards per carry, if you count sacks into that equation. So there are concerns with both of these teams. It's a game that I don't know if I can say Florida needs more. I mean, I think they do, but then again, it's a road game, and if you're Florida, you'd probably, it's a road game and a rivalry game. You definitely need it with the state your head coach is in. But if LSU loses this game, that's going to be an indictment on Brian Kelly, too. I don't think they can afford a loss here either. I mean, when you're competing for the playoffs and a national title, and that's an expectation at LSU, you can't go out and lose to this caliber of Florida team. You can't. So that makes this game really intriguing to me. And there's going to be a ton of storylines surrounding it. Storylines as it specifically relates to the game, not the aftermath of a theoretical result, are how good is Lagway? How good is the lines of scrimmage, or are the lines of scrimmage for Florida? Through 2 weeks, they've looked bad relative to their talent level. I've said it before, and if you're a Florida fan, please be understanding. Do not get offended here. This is not an attack on you. It's an attack on the coaching staff that I think so far has not done a good job with your program. Your coach looks and acts like all you need to win games are bicep veins and just like vascular muscle in general and good vibes. And that coaching and play calling doesn't matter. It's pretty pathetic. As for LSU, I think they've done overall a much better job than Napier has at Florida, coaching-wise. I think that Kelly is a good coach. But Kelly is not perfect either, and Kelly has mismanaged some great rosters we all know about. Jaden Daniels, and if they have any defensive coordinator not named Matt House, they probably achieve more with Jaden Daniels. What about last season, where they had an awesome O-line by NFL talent, but against Florida, against Texas A&M, they didn't hold up all that well, and the defense, again, going back to the Matt House hire and that whole disaster, if you had a different DC in those 2 years, maybe one who still was unqualified for the position but didn't ruin the defense quite to the same degree, then maybe you do go to Atlanta, or maybe you do reach the playoffs last year. I mean, part of the reason Brian Kelly's under pressure is not because the expectations are insanely high. They're not as high as they are at Ohio State, for example, or Georgia or Alabama. They're probably not as high as they are right now at Texas. It's because they've underachieved relative to their talent and also expectations, sometimes to the fault of LSU and their staff, other times not necessarily, and maybe people were placing too high of expectations on them. With LSU, it's important that they're able to lean on their run game. I'm not really as concerned about Nussmeier or the LSU defensive front as I am Florida's quarterback and their defensive front. But LSU's running backs and offensive line and their play caller, Joe Sloan, they need to be able to find a way to lean on the ground game, because in big games, having that ground attack is such a plus to be able to win and pull away. I know the Ravens choked hard to the Bills on Monday Night Football, but you know what? It's still a good asset to have, and the Ravens, in terms of having an elite ability to game control opponents and choking, is kind of an exception to the rule. We all know Michigan's national title run. We all know Georgia's. We know Ohio State's. What did they have in common? Well, whether it was by hoops or by ladders, they had a rushing attack that could cause damage. Ohio State's was due to their running backs. Michigan's and Georgia's was through their offensive line. Find a way to be able to run the football. Some other key factors I want to bring up are whether or not Lagway plays to his ceiling or if he continues to underperform. We already talked about rushing offense, lines of scrimmage, but I think rushing defense is something that also has to be discussed with Florida specifically. Part of it was because with Byron Brown, USF could always have a numbers advantage when running him, and they run him a lot. LSU can't do that. But I also think, and you all know this as well as I do, that LSU's more talented on the offensive line than Florida is. And LSU will also be at home, which means the pressure, the noise, the anxiety, that's all going to be pointed in Florida's direction, at least initially. And coaching is another critical piece to this puzzle here. Coaching is huge in this matchup. I think coaching is the only reason why, looking at both of these teams and rosters, why LSU is a 7.5-point favorite and started off as a 10 or 9.5-point favorite, and why they aren't simply a 3-point favorite, and these teams wouldn't be viewed as a push neutral field. I genuinely believe that. Billy Napier's coaching has been a disaster. The development isn't there. The strategy isn't there. The all they have is effort and look. You are this is going to sound weird, but it feels like with Florida, all they have is effort, and their players all look like 7, 8, 9, or 10s out of 10s looks-wise because they're jacked. But nothing else is there. And that is an indictment on the staff. They have some really good players. They have some players who'd be playing much better now, no doubt, if they were in different positions. And I'm going to be that harsh. It's just like I was with Notre Dame last year. And then Notre Dame went on that playoff run. Freeman every year has improved his game management. That is a credit to him. His staff has improved practically every year, and they are recruiting and developing at a better level every year. Plus, they don't have the type of schedule that Florida has had back-to-back years that can very quickly break you. Not mentally, because I don't think Florida ever mentally broke last year, but those schedules can physically break you too. We saw that, I think, with Lagway's injury. Also saw that with Georgia all of last year, Florida's biggest rival. That schedule kind of incapacitated Georgia's capability of playing to their ceiling. It didn't help Carson Beck, didn't help his offensive line, didn't help his defense, didn't help the wide receivers, and there were some other issues, of course. But at the end of the day, coaching is huge here. Can Napier put together a good game plan? Can he figure out what went wrong and be objective about it and deal with it while still calling plays as he has this year and move on and move forward and put all that pressure towards making a diamond and delivering here in this rivalry game? When I look at the rosters between these teams, I can only think to myself that Florida should have more advantages here than they do, but I just don't see it. Who are the receivers that Florida has that I'm supposed to care about? Where are they? Because I don't see any. I know that in theory they should have talent, but that's a lot of different schools. Clemson, in theory, should have a better rushing offense than they do. Michigan, in theory, should be a definite top 10 team with the talent roster they have. These things are not always the case. Talent does not equal success. It's a massive contributing factor. You need to be talented to win it all. And the biggest reason that actually is because talent correlates with good coaching. Good players love good coaches. Good coaches love good players. That's a huge part of the reason why. Now, it's not, again, always the case, but J. Michael Sturdivant, Eugene Wilson, Aiden Mizzle, Dallas Wilson, Nashawn Montgomery, Tank Hawkins. I haven't seen anything out of Florida's wide receiver room that suggests to me they can threaten an elite defense. And LSU's, I don't think their defense is elite, but it's so much better than it was last year. And they have some mean pass rushers. When I look at Florida's offensive line, with Kanaji Harris, Jake Slaughter, Damian George Jr., Bryce Lovett, Austin Barber, they got size. They have a top 5 O-line in the nation when it comes to size. And unlike some other schools that are simply big on the O-line, they looked good last year. Many viewed them as the top O-line entering 2025. They haven't looked like it at all. DJ Lagway has not looked like even a top 25 quarterback through 2 games. Florida looks bad, to be frank. Baugh and Jacoby Jackson are probably some of the only upsides on offense, and running back is the last position you want to be elite at. Just ask Kenneth Walker at Michigan State. And even he had better receivers than Florida does right now, and Peyton Thorne that year looked better than DJ Lagway does right now. If all you have is an elite running back or good stable of backs, they can compensate for you some, but there's a reason why you have 5 offensive linemen in front of you as the back And, when they miss assignments, the running back and the coaches are furious. The offensive line makes the ground game much more than the running backs do, usually. And then defensively, look, I think they're legit there with, George Gums, Caleb Banks, Tyreek Sapp up front, Miles Graham, Grayson Howard at linebacker. And then I think they have some players at DB too. But at the end of the day, how well do they match up on the road against an LSU roster that is supremely talented? It's a top 6 talent roster per 24/7 Sports talent composite, and it's a more talented roster than what Florida has. How does it match up? Well, I know LSU's better receivers with Xavier Thomas, Nick Anderson, Chris Hilton Jr., Aaron Anderson, and Barian Brown. So far, I think that Josh Thompson, Brycen Moore are better players than what Florida has on the offensive line so far. Florida's O-line, by preseason research, should be much better, but through 2 games, I have not seen that so far. If Trades Green is able to play in this game, that is a huge matchup advantage against Florida's linebackers and defensive backs. Nussmeier's looked better than Lagway. Caden Durham, I don't think he's as good as Barr or Jackson, but you know what? He's impressed me, and he played well last year as a true freshman. Patrick Payton, Bernard Gooden, Dominic McKinley, Jack Pyburn. This is a great defensive line. And I prefer a 4-3 base defense to a 3-3-5 base defense. I just do. I think having four down linemen is critical, with maybe rare exception, to winning a national title and being that good of a team. And Florida is not one of those rare exceptions. They're not. They don't have, if Kirby Smart or Nick Saban or Brent Venables or Jim Knowles ran a 3-3-5, like, be my guest. I mean, you're elite defensive minds. Florida does not have that. They do not. And then Whit Weeks, of course, Harold Perkins, and then West Weeks. And then you look at, Mansour Delane, A.J. Halsey, Tamarcus Cooley, P.J. Woodland, Ashton Stamps. It's a really impressive unit that LSU has. It's a very impressive unit. So I think that the Tigers, they have an edge over Florida in pass defense, rush defense, pass offense. I think the one area Florida has a big matchup edge in is their defensive front versus LSU's rushing offense. The offensive line, the running backs, and the fact that Nussmeier's a statue. He's not running. But LSU's staff is better. Talent's pretty equal, but if I had to go one direction there, it would be LSU. I think LSU also has the better special teams unit. So with all that being said, give me Florida. Give me Florida to win. Or not Florida. Sorry. Not Florida. Give me Florida to cover, but give me LSU to win. That's what I'm picking here. I think LSU wins and Florida covers. I think that LSU wins this game by anywhere from 4 to 11 points. So could win by double digits, could win by as few as a field goal or a little over a field goal. I think LSU is winning this game, though, and I think that they'll look like the better team throughout all 60 minutes, but Florida just has enough talent and physicality, and LSU has enough weaknesses for the Gators to keep this game close with the Tigers. Now let's talk about Georgia and Tennessee. This game should be pretty fun. Very fun. Let me see. Oh, we have 20 concurrent viewers. That's pretty good. And yeah, I agree, the Duck Knight. Neither of these teams look great. None of them. None of them look great. That's for sure. I really don't like Florida. I like LSU. I just don't think LSU is an elite team. But LSU impressed me with what they did against Clemson. That's for sure. LSU is definitely a superior team compared to what I thought they were going to be. Bless me there. Now I want to talk about Georgia and Tennessee. We'll talk about this game. We'll get into some others. I think we have a few more games to get through, and then we'll get on out of here. So, how long have I been live again? Yeah, I was gonna say I feel like it's been Yeah. Oh, damn. 50 minutes? Damn. Didn't intend for each of those segments to go long, but whatever. All right. Georgia and Tennessee. Georgia takes on the Tennessee Volunteers, this time on the road in Knoxville, in Neyland Stadium at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. At kickoff, it's going to be hot. 80 degrees Fahrenheit, or at least hot for me. I'm from Michigan. 1 mile per hour winds, perfect conditions for throwing the football. Not going to be raining. Georgia is a 3.5-point favorite. What do we think about this game and this matchup? Georgia has won 8 in a row, but right now, it's going to be played at Tennessee. Yeah. Georgia's won 8 in a row, but it's in Tennessee this year. Tennessee feels confident about this matchup. The line is pretty short for the fact that Georgia is one of the national title favorites per FanDuel in any sports book you look at. And Tennessee, they beat Syracuse, but Syracuse is able to score points on them, and Tennessee does not recruit at the caliber that Georgia does. Even the most optimistic Tennessee fan will tell you that. So, what's up with this game, and what's Tennessee's path to victory here? That's the storyline. Again, Georgia's won 8 in a row. So, why is this line small, and what can the Volunteers do to emerge with a win here? Well, I want to start off with painting a picture of how this matchup has gone really the previous 3 years. Or we could even go to 2021, but I don't want to do that because that was Heupel's first year. So 2022, Tennessee embarrasses Alabama's defense. That Alabama defense was a top 5 defense in advanced analytics, but that was just because talent was carrying them. That's straight up what it was. Against Tennessee, and you saw this even a bit against LSU, that defense folded when it mattered most. I think that what happened in that game was Tennessee and Josh Heupel and Alex Golesh outcoached Pete Golding. They were able to identify mismatches, and Alabama did not have the defensive line and defensive front, not even close to what Georgia did. Even with Alabama having Will Anderson, Alabama that year was pretty light on the defensive line. And not being able to have disruptors up front, several of them, against an offense that Heupel runs, which is, all about timing. Many think it's a pure passing offense, but it's not. Passing is a very important component and spreading out the defense wide. But they like to run the ball, and they like to run it down your throat. And with the matchup edge that they had at receiver on DB, combined with the matchup edge they had running the football, they were going to score on Alabama's defense. But that same year, Georgia mauls them in Athens, and a big part of the reason why is Georgia had the superior D-line, the superior O-line, the superior defense, and probably had the superior secondary, and were also better coached. Georgia, historically, has just been a much worse matchup, and by historically I mean in the 2020s, a worse matchup for Tennessee than Alabama has been. In fact, I would argue Tennessee is a good matchup, schematically, coaching, roster-wise against Alabama, and a bad matchup historically in recent memory versus Georgia. But is that the case this year? Is it? Well, I think that in a certain sense, you can make the argument that now's the time because both lost a ton. Georgia has looked shaky at quarterback. We don't know what Georgia's offensive line situation is. Tennessee's at home. I think we know that parts of Tennessee's defense are solid, and based on what I've seen against Syracuse, and I know East Tennessee State's an FCS team, but regardless of that, Tennessee still, I think, can run the ball and run it quite well, and Aguilar has had some good moments. On the other hand, though, part of me thinks that Tennessee's year, in a sense, was last season, when Georgia was banged up, when Georgia had the inferior rushing offense, when Tennessee had an electric defensive line and defensive front that is certainly better than this year's, and when they were able to jump out to look a 10-0 lead and score 17 points in the first half. But Georgia was able to gain control, and through superior quarterback play, home field advantage, better second half adjustments, they ended up with a win. There is a lot of unknowns in this game. This will be the toughest test that either team has faced so far. Georgia has a 0.592 scoring offense in terms of points per play. They score almost 0.6 points per play. But that is a sample that purely comes from Marshall. Don't look at FCS opponents, or at least these numbers don't. For Tennessee, they score 0.662 points per play. That one sample coming from a Syracuse team that we don't know is better than Marshall. And then defensively, Georgia so far I think has been more impressive than Tennessee through the numbers. The same as how Tennessee through the numbers has been more impressive than Georgia offensively. Georgia's defense only allowing 0.135 points per play. Tennessee allowing 0.292 points per play. That number's a little bit concerning given the Syracuse team they played, and we'll come back to that. But Georgia's quarterback play, to a certain degree, has also been a little bit concerning as well. FPI thinks Tennessee should slightly be favored here. 18.9 points better than the average team is what Tennessee's rating is. That's ninth. Georgia's is sixth with a 20.3 rating. Georgia, I think you got Zachariah Branch. I think you got Colby Young as some of your X-Factor receivers, and I think that is a X-Factor unit for Georgia. The defensive line with Christian Miller, Gabe Harris, Elo Madozi, a linebacker where you got Chris Cole, and you also have C.J. Allen and Raylan Wilson. For Tennessee, their running backs, Deshaun Bishop, Star Thomas, tight end Miles Kitzelman, and then on the defensive line, they're not as strong as they were last year, but I think they have some players at defensive end that personally impress me. So Dominic Bailey, for example, Joshua Josephs. They do bring back Brycen Eason at nose tackle. So that plus, Arian Carter, Jeremiah Tillander, who both came back from last year and had significant playing time, is encouraging. This is a rivalry game. It is a game with a ton of excitement, with a lot at stake. It would be massive for Tennessee to earn a win here, given everything that transpired in the preseason, and the fact that many reacted to Nico leaving Tennessee saying, yeah, this is a rebuild year. You're not doing anything. With Tennessee's schedule, if they earn this win, they're probably going to the playoffs. Especially, too, with how Florida's season has gone. There's a chance that Florida could quit by the time they play them. Alabama doesn't look as strong as even some of Alabama's doubters thought they were going to be in the preseason. And if they beat Georgia, who at this point looks like their toughest opponent all year, who's to say they can't go to Atlanta if they somehow pull this off? So this is a program game for Tennessee. That cannot be overstated. As for Georgia here, I wouldn't call this a program game, because I think if Georgia loses this, you still have Kirby Smart. You still have all the talent in the world. It's only one of your 3 true road games, and who knows, Tennessee might be one of the better teams on your schedule. And because you're a younger team in Georgia right now, you'll probably get better as the year goes on. It's better to lose a game here and now and use that as fire and motivation and the coaches to go back to the drawing board with something while your team is young and while you're looking to help them maximize their potential, rather than later in the year. Especially since the committee we all know is recency bias. It's better to lose earlier in the year than later in the year. My question for both of these teams is, how real have they been in the first 2 weeks? What have they shown us that's legitimate? What are overblown concerns? Are they hiding anything? I've been very public before on this channel and also on my Twitter that I think Georgia is hiding stuff. With Tennessee, I don't quite know. They're not as talented as Georgia. I think their staff internally probably knows that. And I think everyone with a brain thought that Syracuse would be better than they turned out to be. Maybe not everyone with a brain. There were some people with a brain who totally saw that coming. The Syracuse near collapse against UConn and them getting destroyed by Tennessee. I thought they'd lose pretty badly to Tennessee. The fact they almost lost to UConn was kind of a shocker in a sense. A key factor that we've already just touched on are schematic changes. Is the matchup any different than what it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago? Is it like last year's? Is it somewhere in between? If you're Tennessee, you're hoping it's like last year's matchup because Stockton is not as good of a thrower of the football as Beck, and you're at home. I think, I'll say this here, that 2024 Tennessee beats Georgia if they play this Georgia in Neyland. I think they'd beat them. Now, by how much? I do not know. Probably not by much, but I think they'd find a way to win. I think the matchup would just be too good that it would compensate for some advantages that Georgia has. But we're not talking about 2024 Tennessee. With Nico, with Dylan Sampson, with a more experienced offensive line, and a deeper defense, and also healthy corners, which Tennessee doesn't have. We're talking about this Tennessee team. So some other factors to pay attention to are superior QB play. Is Stockton as bad as some advertise? Is he as good as maybe his optimists and supporters advertise? Is Aguilar as good as his supporters advertise? Who makes the better second half adjustments? And which offensive line is able to better compensate for their inexperience and play a better game? Those are very important factors. If Gunnar Stockton is a great QB, I don't like Tennessee's chances here because I think they have the air advantage with their receivers and how much they've upgraded compared to how much Tennessee arguably compared to last year's downgraded defensively, especially on the defensive side of the ball when you factor in the current injuries. Their two starting corners, Jermon McCoy, who I think is an All-American, they won't be playing in this game. That's huge. It's absolutely huge. And yet that line is only 3.5 in favor of Georgia. So makes you think a little bit. Vegas sportsbooks are definitely expecting a close game here. But if Aguilar's the superior quarterback and Stockton is maybe bad, then Georgia's probably not taking advantage of the injuries at DB. And Georgia's been a little bit more vulnerable at DB than in prior years as well. So there are things to take advantage of here from both sides. When I peer at these rosters and come down to make the final decision, I can't help but think to myself that Georgia isn't just more talented. It's the idea that Georgia has done a better job developing their roster. I think that Georgia's offense versus Tennessee's defense is going to be, pretty back and forth. It's going to be like a tug of war with no winner. What I think pulls Georgia across that line to win that battle of tug of war is their defense against Tennessee's offense. I have no idea how Tennessee's going to be able to move the ball in this game. No idea at all. I don't know. I think that, look, hanging 40 points on Syracuse is impressive. Newsflash. Syracuse had a pretty mediocre offense, and they put up 26 points on you. They have a defense that's probably non-existent given how many points they surrendered to a UConn team that is far less talented than Syracuse. And they did so at home. It's not like they traveled to UConn. And sometimes in those sleepy matchups, home field advantage can almost matter more than in some of these bigger matchups where the players, a lot of teams, I think, feed off of opponent crowd noise. Ohio State does this. Just look at how they play Penn State in Happy Valley. They feed off crowd noise. Alabama, Georgia, they do this. The great teams, even some teams that aren't national title contenders but are just well coached, they feed off of adversity. They feed off crowd noise. They don't quit. So I believe that Georgia has the better roster, the vastly better staff. They are vastly more talented. And it'd be one thing if Tennessee had a big experience edge and also a big roster edge. That's kind of the 2021 Michigan versus 2021 Ohio State comparison there. Except 2021 Michigan was at least better coached than 2021 Ohio State was. That's not the case here. So not only does Tennessee not have a key matchup edge like they have over Alabama, or a coaching edge as they had over Alabama in 22, over Alabama last year, and as some other big-time games, big rivalry games where maybe the inferior team in terms of high school recruiting talents had a matchup edge roster-wise over their opponent. Tennessee doesn't have any of those, I don't think. I like Georgia to win, and I like them to cover that 3.5-point spread. And I like them to do it in kind of a big-time fashion. I like them to not necessarily dominate this game, but I like them to win decisively, win by 10 or more points here. I think that it will look similar to not 2022, where Georgia could have made it 40-10 or 40-3 if they wanted to. I think it'll look a lot like last year in terms of final score and in terms of pace of the game, with some elements of that 2023 game where Tennessee comes out early, but Georgia shows their improvements in power rushing compared to last year, and they really begin to eat away at Tennessee as the game goes on. All right, now we can talk about Oregon and Northwestern. That's what we can talk about now. Okay. Let me see any comments that we have. Any comments that I have to answer right now. Oregon at the end of the third quarter at Wisconsin using their song tradition against them. Yeah, exactly. Michigan did that at Wisconsin in 2021. The great teams feed off of adversity. They just do. Now, speaking of adversity, it's time to get to Northwestern. But before we do that, I do have to apologize yet again. I do have to go and get a drink of water. So I'm going to do that, and I'll be right back. All right, and we're back. Thank you for your patience. Really appreciate it. Just gonna respond to text real quick. All right. Let's resume. Talk about Oregon versus Northwestern. Big noon kickoff brings us Oregon traveling to Northwestern this Saturday afternoon at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. That is 9 a.m. Central Time for you Oregon folks, which the reason I'm pausing there is because that's so weird. And it's not just weird, it's actually quite wrong. I don't think that teams out west should be playing that early. Not saying that it's an excuse for poor performance or you got to complain about it 24/7, 365, but that's bad. That's not what football's about. Football's about playing within specific constraints and in a game that already has a lot of inequality, and it's part of what makes the game fun is that Alabama gets a bunch of talented players and Boise State doesn't. You got to make sure you do have some restraints that at least protect teams and make life easier for them. Oregon's not one to complain. Oregon, according to FPI, is actually the number one team in college football. We'll see if that's true. It's believable, I think, certainly. And Northwestern is not viewed as a good team. That's why Oregon's favored by 27.5 points, even with the early kickoff, even with the travel, and Northwestern's home field advantage. Weather should be 71 degrees Fahrenheit, 6 mile per hour winds, probably a nice breeze coming off of Lake Michigan. Hopefully they bring the inflatable duck there. The only reason to talk about this game in a preview sense is to discuss what could Northwestern's path to victory or path to making the game uncomfortable for Oregon look like. We know that Oregon's the better team. That's why their points per play margin is a 1.065. For every one play Oregon runs, they score one more point than their opponent, than one of their opponent does on the plays they run. Oregon so far through 2 games, now the FCS data isn't counted in the information I use, but through 1 game, they straight up, well, they average more than a point per play. It's crazy. It's unfathomable. It's unsustainable too. This won't hold for the rest of the year, even if they have a 2019 LSU caliber offense or somehow have something better than that. It's not sustainable through conference play. But it's remarkable that they even have it through 1 game. And I imagine if you included the Montana State game, that would be a similar number too. Northwestern, meanwhile, isn't even scoring a tenth of a point per play, only counting their game against Tulane, and their points per play margin is a -1/5 of a point. Pretty bad. I mean, Tulane beat them down and beat them down pretty harshly. And you look at FPI, Oregon a 24.7 rating, first in America, Northwestern a -2.6, 75th in America. The spread is about correct, and home field advantage isn't really being factored in a ton here in this line, at least according to what I'm seeing from FPI and power ratings. That makes sense. Northwestern doesn't have a massive home field advantage. Usually when they play a bigger brand, it's more like they're playing at a neutral field in their time zone. The X factors here are Northwestern's defensive front, including, Aiden Hubbard, including Makud Layan, and then for Oregon, I think tight end Kenyon Sadiq, their offensive line, which includes the Iapani Lololu, Alex Harkey, Isaiah World, Dave Uli, and then, of course, you got Matthew Bedford and Emmanuel Pregnon, and then on the defensive line, Mateo Uyunglele, Tatum Tuioti, Bear Alexander, Amari Washington. Northwestern's the inferior team. They're basically 4 touchdown underdogs, so how in the heck are they going to even hope to survive here? Well, if Oregon doesn't play its A game, and we've seen these ex-Pac-12 teams in the Big Ten, when they go on the road, life gets rough, and they don't play their A game. I cannot count a single time last year where any of those teams on the West Coast went out to the East and played their A game. Same actually with the East Coast teams going out to the West Coast. I haven't seen that. I mean, it's no coincidence that Ohio State goes out to Autzen last year and their defense is shooken up. Their O-line is committing false starts left and right even when they were healthy and Simmons didn't go down, and why Howard and parts of their offense looked gassed and frightened. Like, that time change and travel and then playing a good team on top of that is hard. Now, Northwestern's not a good team, but what if they come out and they play like it for a bit and they shock Oregon and Oregon isn't prepared to be shocked? Well, I think that is where you begin to lay down the storyline for how Northwestern pulls off an amazing upset, or they hang around for a half or three quarters and maybe Oregon pulls away and still covers. But at least some people are saying, hey, I know Oregon won 45 to 10, but it was 24-10 or 17-10 late in the third quarter. Like, Oregon may have some issues here that we have to pay attention to. That's how you get down to that path. And some other things that all really have to go Northwestern's way for them to win. You're talking about motivation. Northwestern has to be entirely motivated here, and Oregon can not come in viewing themselves as the hunter. Or maybe they do, but they're really viewing this as a business trip to relax. You can't have Oregon going on heat-seeking missile mode. It's part of the reason why I think David Braun was so like affectionate towards Oregon in his press conference previewing this game. We saw what happened with Mike Gundy in Oregon State. You do not want to attract Oregon's bad side. You don't. The travel. Even if Oregon's motivated here, if somehow the travel really affects them, and I don't think it will because it's their first trip out here. Now, when they go out to Penn State and it's their second one and it's further, and then they have to drive after that, it'll probably affect them more. When they have to go out to Rutgers after that, out to Iowa, and then it really begins to build up, it'll probably be worse than this game. Playing a tougher opponent, yeah, but when you do this several times in a few months, and then you have to play physical and play to your A game, that can suck. We saw how that affected USC and Washington last year, and even UCLA too. Preston Stone, does he play to his 2023 level, where he was the starting quarterback for SMU, led them to an 11-3 year where they won the American? Or does his 2024 self show up, where he was turnover prone, got benched for Kevin Jennings, and that seems to have continued this year where he isn't playing too well at Northwestern so far? Can Northwestern hold on at the lines of scrimmage, and can they find any open receivers to not have to solely rely on their rushing offense, which seems to be their strength right now? Those are some key questions. Those are some things that, well, are highly improbable to all go Northwestern's way, to put it frankly. I'm not convinced here that Northwestern is going to have a good day on Saturday. And a big part of the reason why that is because Oregon is just that much better, and it's their first trip out east. Again, if they were playing a better team, that travel could be the deciding factor that flips the coin. What that could be is that could be a faulty coin. That could be a cheat coin. If they played a better team on the road, pretty equivalent to them in talent, like Penn State, Ohio State, but they had to travel those thousands of miles, and Ohio State and Penn State didn't. That could be the cheat coin that just in that scenario almost always goes their opponent's way, because most things are equal, but that jet lag and that hornet's nest they're playing, and it's just a bad combination. Northwestern is not a hornet's nest, and while jet lag could be a thing here, the rosters are just so unequal that it would kind of be an indictment on Oregon to not come in here and win by a zillion points. Maybe I'm wrong, though. But I do think that Oregon, pass offense, and pass defense, and rush offense-wise, has an unquantifiable advantage. The only way I can see Northwestern keeping this close, if all those factors go their way, is if they are able to run the ball, and for whatever reason, Oregon can't hold them to fewer than 4 or 3.5 yards per carry. And Northwestern condenses the game. Dante Moore maybe has a meltdown. Maybe Preston Stone plays his A game, one of the better games of his career. And that way Northwestern could pull it off, or at least keep this within single digits. But with Oregon having the coaching edge, special teams edge, the talent edge, and the edge at basically every position, I can't pick Northwestern to win this game or let alone cover. I think Oregon wins. I think they cover that 27.5 point line. I do not think Oregon will look as good as they did against Oklahoma State or Montana State, though. But we all remember last year, they traveled out Friday night to play Purdue, and that was after they had some trips out east before. Like, that wasn't their first trip out there. At least I don't think. Maybe I'm wrong. That was their first trip. Now that I think about it, actually, I do think that was their first trip, or at least their second trip. They went out there, and they beat them 35-0. And it was a very sloppy 35-0, but 35-0 nonetheless. So I think even if Oregon doesn't play its A game, they're going to cover this line. They're going to win by, anywhere from 35 to probably 50-something points is what I think. Regardless if they play their C game, B game, or A game, you'll be able to tell that by watching the film and the drive chart. But the talent edge is so big here that I can't honestly pick Northwestern to do anything in this matchup. It is similar vibes here, I'm not going to lie, for USC and Purdue. We're going to go through and preview that, but I do think that USC is a significantly better team than Purdue. Purdue is probably a better team than Northwestern, looking at the advanced analytics, but at the same time, at the same time, we'll just, bless me, we'll have to see here. Do they play? I forget if they play or not. I don't think they play this year. They played last year, and Northwestern won 26-20 in overtime. So that shows how bad Northwestern was. But let's get on to this game and discuss it. USC makes their first trip out east in the 2025 season, traveling to West Lafayette, Indiana, to take on the Purdue Boilermakers at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That is 12:30 p.m. Pacific Time for you USC folks, or ex-Pac-12 folks out in the Pacific time zone. Should be 83 degrees Fahrenheit around kickoff, 5 miles per hour, and the spread is USC minus 20.5. A pretty big line for playing at Purdue, upset city, one of the better teams in America at punching above their weight class, at least historically and in recent memory. But history, while it is a useful indicator and teacher, is not a determining factor. That's probably not the right phrase, but what I mean by that is just because it has happened doesn't mean it will happen. That's the simplest way to put it. Correlation does not equal causation. Just because Purdue historically has had this large sample size of big upsets does not mean one is always coming. Purdue has been impressive through 2 weeks, given the talent they have, the mass turnover, the new coaching staff. They're 2-0. They have had, I believe they've shut out both of their opponents. I don't think they've allowed points from any of their opponents. Correct me if I'm wrong there, or maybe they've just allowed a touchdown or maybe two. But their defense has looked markedly better from where it was last year. And credit to Barry Odom for that change. Ryan Brown has looked impressive at quarterback. I think he is an X factor in this game. He is one of Purdue's better players to this point. So what can he and Purdue do in this game to really come away with what would be a pretty signature win? And it's a signature win, even though USC isn't ranked in the polls, because per power ratings, USC is the 5th best team in America. And even per sports books, who don't adjust their power ratings as aggressively as FPI does, the sports books are coming along to USC here. And I said in the preseason, USC's a playoff team. USC's even a fringe national title team. And they're playing like it so far, even adjusting for their competition. USC right now is only one of 2 teams, the other being Oregon, who is scoring more than 1 point per play. They're scoring 1.091 points per play. Their points per play margin is 0.862, which is almost 1 whole additional point per one of their plays compared to one of their opponents' plays, which is crazy. Defensively, though, they're allowing 0.229 points per play. Oregon hasn't allowed, they don't allow any points per opponent play, which means, yes, they've shut out their opponents so far. Pretty crazy, I will add, given where Purdue's defense was last year. Per the lines, or per the power ratings, the line should be where it's at. I mean, USC is viewed as about 24 and a half points better than Purdue, just looking at FPI, adjusting for home field advantage, and probably adding some travel there too, because they're traveling several time zones. That'll get you to 20 and a half, maybe 21 and a half. USC is clearly the better team here. Jade Mayava's looked very impressive. Jacoby Lane and Makai Lemon They could, I don't think they do yet, but they could, based on some of the plays I've seen, rival Carnell Tate and Jeremiah Smith for wide receiver 1 and 2 for the best wide receiver duo this year. Said could, not that they do right now, but they could. We'll see where that develops. Smith's obviously the best wide receiver prospect out of any of those 4. Tate's probably the second best, but we'll see where that ends up going. Waymon Jordan, Eli Sanders, Brian Jackson, love them at running back. And then USC is, Eric Gentry at linebacker, Kamari Ramsey at safety. They have some players that I think are really quite impressive overall on both sides of the ball, not just on the offensive side of the football. A storyline to pay attention to here, I think, is the roster turnover for Purdue, and whether that with Barry Odom's coaching has truly translated to a drastic improvement, or the coaching's gotten better, so they're able to beat the bad teams they've played so far that have inferior talent. They've beaten them pretty badly. But then when you have to scale talent here and compensate for it, if it all falls apart and it's like, oh, well, Purdue's better coached, so they're going to win more games and do a much better job against inferior competition. They won't lose to Wisconsin by 50, for example. But against a USC, against teams with a blue chip ratio of 50% or greater, they're just dead. They have no hope. For USC, it's sort of the opposite question. Can they, or not the opposite question, but a question that is related but comes from the opposite angle. So it's not an opposite question, but for Purdue, the question is, can they compensate for their talent? For USC, it's can they compensate for not maximizing their talent previously? Has that changed? Has their coaching upgraded to the point where they're able to utilize talent that they honestly have wasted kind of for the past 3 years? I know they went 11-3 and overachieved some expectations in 2022, but with hindsight, that was probably a wasted year. In hindsight, that team should have made the playoffs. Not competed for a title, it was too early. They should have made the playoffs with Caleb Williams. And they shouldn't have brought Alex Grinch back in 23, and it's a whole different rabbit hole we can go down. But that's USC's big question right there. I think that USC has improved coaching-wise. I also think Purdue has improved coaching-wise too. So if I had to give an answer to these questions, these storylines, I would say yes to both of them, if I'm being honest. I think Purdue is a better quality team. I think they have a brighter future under Odom than Ryan Walters, and I think USC is turning a corner here. Does travel affect USC to the degree that Purdue can help compensate for the talent mismatch? Can they out-effort the Trojans? What's Purdue's mental state? Does Ryan Brown have hope to outplay, to outduel Jaden Maiava? Is USC's defense as shaky as ESPN's FPI and the advanced analytics suggest? And at the end of it all, does regression to the mean occur for USC? Because USC has lost close game after close game after close game under Lincoln Riley, and Lincoln Riley traditionally, historically, doesn't mean this will always be the case, but traditionally does a pretty good job of winning close games. And usually in these upsets, how the upsets occur is the underdog wins in a close game. They massively overachieve the spread, but they don't blow out their opponent. Sometimes they do. Purdue, actually, when they have beaten, Michigan State and Ohio State and Iowa in recent memory, has won those games by 2 or more possessions. But what about here? Again, this isn't Jeff Brom, Purdue, who all those 3 games I mentioned against opponents who at the time were ranked top 3, he beat. This is 2 coaching staffs removed from Jeff Brom. And we've seen what Brom's done at Louisville. That guy's a genius. I think he is a top 10 coach in terms of game management. So those are some critical questions to ask. And ultimately, I'm going with USC to win big here. I don't think that the Trojans, just because they're playing on the road against Purdue, are going to have major issues. I just don't think that. I really don't think that whatsoever. I think that right here, right now, USC is here. USC is on a really positive track. USC's impressed me with their offensive line, their rushing attack, the touch that Jaden Maiava has with his arm, the fact that their receivers can compensate for bad throws or possession throws if Maiava decides to make them. They just have playmakers everywhere and really good coaches, better coaches than I think they've ever had. And I just don't think Purdue is there. And again, USC, even if you throw the Alex Grinch years out and acknowledge 2024 as kind of the reset year, then they're in year 2 and Purdue's in year 1. Combine that with the talent mismatch and the fact that there isn't really a roster edge Purdue has. I think USC is drastically better than Purdue with their offense against Purdue's defense. Wouldn't shock me with some of the, backs like, Devin Maccabee and then Ryan Brown and some of the receivers they have, if Purdue's able to maybe score some points here. Georgia Southern, Missouri State did, so why couldn't Purdue, who probably has more talent and is going to be playing at home? But ultimately, I think USC's defense is still better than Purdue's offense, and their staff is better, their talent's much better, their teams are better. It's just a bad matchup for Purdue. So I'm going with USC to win. I'm going with them to cover. I think it will be a blowout. I think it'll be ugly. This does not mean you should sell your stock in Barry Odom and Purdue. I just think USC is that good, and Purdue still has some work to do. Speaking of some things to work on, we got to talk about USF, and we got to talk about Miami here. The 2-0, top 20, specifically 18th ranked USF Bulls travel to the Miami Hurricanes, who are ranked inside of the top 10 or top 5, depending on where you look. Also 2-0. Going to be 80 degrees at kickoff, approximately 1 mile per hour in a sold-out Hard Rock Stadium, Miami being favored by 17.5 points. The public is high on USF. The public is with USF. May the force be with you is that common phrase in Star Wars. It's like the equivalent of, in our reality, God be with you. For example, a phrase that I came up with that I think is ingenious, and I don't think I'm all that, I don't think I'm a genius, but I think this phrase is, may the public not be with you. May they not be, because when the public is with you, especially to this degree, very bad things happen, usually. So that's where I just wanted to start this off, is a fair warning that it's not me saying I think Miami's going to win by 50 here. It's not what I'm saying at all. But the public being with a team that is this big of an underdog with this talent discrepancy, not in its favor, but against it, is a huge red flag. It is a massive red flag. Even some of the advanced analytics, you could probably geek yourself out into thinking that USF's going to be competitive here. You want it to happen. Looking at Miami's game against Notre Dame actually outplayed them on a points per play basis. USF, meanwhile, they blew out Boise and they defeated Florida in the Swamp, which is probably a much more intimidating environment than Hard Rock Stadium. And Miami currently is not that big of a favorite over Florida. So you think to yourself, well, why can't USF win? And we're going to talk about how they can win here in this segment too. But Miami, don't be deceived by some early numbers or the fact that USF is 2-0 and so is Miami, and you think because the records are identical and both have a ranked win that means they're similar teams. They are not. They are not similar teams. Notre Dame, if they played Florida neutral field, Notre Dame would be favored by, I would say, double digits. They'd be favored neutral field over Florida. Double digits. USF would be a double-digit underdog still. But beating Notre Dame even at home is more impressive than beating Florida on the road, based on what we've seen from those teams, what we know about them from a preseason research standpoint. Even people like myself, who were very low on Notre Dame in the preseason, and I was at least moderately high on Florida. I was higher on Florida than I was Notre Dame relative to their preseason placements and talent level. Even I thought Notre Dame would be better than Florida, just coaching-wise, Freeman's better than Napier, and Notre Dame roster-wise, I think, is ahead of Florida as well. And USF, mind you, won that game based on a safety. That's basically how they won. And then a fluke touchdown on broken tackles. Not taking anything away from USF, I hate incompetent coaching, so it was the funniest and one of the most enjoyable moments of the year to watch USF beat Florida, because Napier sucks. It's just reality. I don't think he's going to be able to save his job. Your players can only love you so much before realizing, yeah, we're not winning with this guy. It's called the Scott Frost effect. USF can win here. And the power ratings and the advanced analytics back up the fact that they may have a chance. They're a 7.3 rated team per FPI. Miami's only a 13 rated team per FPI. I think Byron Brown is an X-factor player, and USF on defense and in the trenches has really impressed me, as has Miami, where they have Inez Cooper, James Brockermeyer, Francis Mauigoa, Carson Beck at QB. They got David Blay, Akeem Mesidor, and Justin Scott, Armando Blount, and then Ruben Bain Jr., who could be the best defensive end in America on that defensive line. However, USF has a chance, but a lot will have to go their way. So that, I think, is a huge factor here, is what's USF's game plan, and how do they execute it, and how do they change it? Can they, because Notre Dame was able to do this to a certain degree, with a quarterback who isn't as good at running the ball, but probably a better O-line, definitely a better O-line. They were able to use quarterback run to a numbers advantage at times against Miami and have it succeed. That's what USF loves to do with Alex Golish's system and Byron Brown at QB. And Brown is healthy right now. So can they do that? If they cannot, can they throw on Miami? Can they exploit a secondary that had a coverage bust late against Notre Dame, and honestly, given what Notre Dame had on offense, probably didn't perform to their ceiling quite yet. It's still early in the year. Heatherman's still implementing his defense, and to a certain degree, there's only so much he can do because it is year one. When I look at the trenches and power running, who wins there? USF, because of quarterback run in part, has had some success, and their trenches have looked physical. I watched that Florida game, and they matched Florida's physicality pound for pound. With Miami, though, they're one of the best teams in the country in the trenches. Cristobal's an O-line coach. They could have the nation's best O-line, and their D-line is mean. It's nasty. I love what they have. I love what they have there. Finally, explosive plays are going to be a part of this game. That's how USF was able to really snowball Boise, is that touchdown on the punt pass that really broke open the game, and then Boise going for a fourth down, always failing, USF capitalizing on it, and then that big touchdown is really what helped them beat Florida and really pull ahead in that game, was that long touchdown. And with Miami, big plays were a big part of the reason why they were able to beat Notre Dame. Third down conversions, taking advantage of Notre Dame's man coverage. I think that if USF is going to win this matchup, it will be due to them hanging around and likely trailing for much of the game entering the fourth. And then they have a huge fourth quarter, and they're able to use Brown's running ability and maybe taking advantage of a shakier Miami secondary to make big plays. But again, may the public not be with you, because if they are, okay, this is kind of a, I don't know how appropriate this is, but if the public isn't with you, if you believe in God, it's very unlikely that the result he's determined is going to be with you. The public gets a lot of this stuff wrong in terms of sports betting. Gets a ton of stuff wrong. So if the public is with you, odds are, from a statistical standpoint, in a big game like this where the line is definitely going one way decisively, which means the books and the experts are saying, no, one team's decisively better, then the public's not going to be right. So this is an example of the Fade the Public campaign that I started after week one, when the analysts picked Notre Dame and the analysts picked Texas. We picked Miami and Ohio State. We're going to be picking the Canes here again. I'm a big fan of the Canes. I was a fan of theirs last year. I am a huge fan of theirs this year, just based on preseason research. This is a really good team, could be better than last year's team. Their pass defense and pass offense is going to eat USF alive. Their rushing offense will eat USF alive. They may at times have a hard time stopping the run due to USF having a numbers advantage, but that will go away pretty quickly due to the fact that I think Miami will score, establish a clean lead, and at that point USF will have to abandon their identity to even have hope in really keeping this game close. So I'm going with the big favorite here. Miami's going to destroy USF. They're not just going to beat them, because I think a lot of people who know ball believe that Miami's going to win. I'm telling you, the scope of this win will be such that Miami will be overvalued by the general public after this game. The public who is high on USF, they're going to overreact and think that Miami is the second coming here. And also, USF is going to be very undervalued by the public. USF's a good team. They're a good G5 team. It's probably them or Tulane who are the best G5 team as it stands right now. Maybe if Boise figures out their issues, they can be too. But with that Florida win and also playing Miami here, all USF has to do is probably win the American, and they're in the playoffs. So don't take this the wrong way in the sense that I think USF's a bad team and Miami's an elite team. I think Miami still has some issues to resolve before they can become an elite team. And I think USF's good for a G6 team. In fact, they might even be elite for a G6 team. They certainly have elite coaching for a G6 league. But the gap between the G6 and Power 4 has almost never been wider, in a sense. So I'm going with Miami to win here, and I'm going with them to cover and cover big. And the last game we will be talking about, Wisconsin against Alabama. Then we will get out of here. Oh, hey, Blue Wolverine. Nice to see you in here. We're not talking about Michigan today, Blue Wolverine, but there will be a Michigan video tomorrow, just quickly previewing the CMU game and what I want to see out of Michigan. Just didn't have time to fit it in the live show. But, yeah. Oh, and yeah, Sean Morosi, USF did give Alabama a game last year. Was it because USF was amazing? Not necessarily. I think Alabama had just a ton of issues last year. But, yeah, they gave him a game. And yes, they're getting 17 points. 17 and a half, USF is. I think Miami's going to win this game by 30 or more points. I really believe that. Like, it's not because they're 30 points better than Florida. It's the fact that USF now has the world's attention. They have Miami's selling out Hard Rock Stadium. That place is going to be a hornet's nest, and it rarely is. That's how you know they have Miami's attention. And Miami is so much better coached and more balanced than Florida is, and they've looked so much better than Florida. Like, the Florida team Miami played, or the Florida team USF played in week 2 would get blown out by this Miami team. Does not mean they will blow out Florida in 2 weeks. I actually don't think I'm inclined to think they won't blow out Florida in 2 weeks. But just the way this game's being set up makes me lean strongly Miami here. Now, if USF ended up losing in a close one to Florida, and then Miami had to travel to USF, that might make me reconsider like a 17.5 point line. I'd still probably pick Miami to win. Don't know if I'd pick them to dominate in the way that I think they will, but I think that makes a lot of sense. Again, when the public is all over a team that is a 3-score underdog, be wary. It's like the public being on TCU in that national title game. Actually, guilty as charged there. It's a pretty embarrassing thing to mention. Only 2 years into my channel, I know I got to give myself grace, but the fact that I thought TCU could even play Georgia competitively was laughable. There's just no way that was going to happen. Let's talk about this, though. It's another game with a massive line, but one worthy of discussing. The Wisconsin Badgers, standing at 2-0, but unranked, travel to play the 19th-ranked, 1-1, angry Alabama Crimson Tide in Tuscaloosa in Bryant-Denny Stadium. 87 degrees Fahrenheit will be about the temperature at kickoff with 4-mile-per-hour winds, and Alabama's favored by 21.5 points. Pretty incredible. Didn't they just lose to a Florida State team who went 2-10? Don't think that way. Do not think that way. That is the trap that certain people want you to fall into. That is a trap that Luke Fickell certainly is not allowing his Wisconsin team to fall into. And they have issues too. A lot of issues. And I know that, college football fans, they don't want Alabama and these dominant schools to continue to be dominant. They don't. And I empathize with that. Chaos is fun. But that doesn't mean, just because something is fun, doesn't mean that it's good, although I think for college football, chaos is actually pretty good for the sport. But that doesn't mean it's going to happen. Just because it's fun, just because you'd like it to happen, doesn't mean that it will. Wisconsin, through 2 games against FBS opponents, has a points per play margin of 0.348. That's somewhat disappointing against the level of competition they're playing, but they also are playing that lower level competition better than they did last year, even with the QB injury. It's doubtful, by the way, that Billy Edwards will play in this game. That's probably a big part of the reason why the line is 21.5 and not 17.5 or even 14.5. I really do think that a healthy Billy Edwards is much better suited for not just Wisconsin, but this type of matchup than Danny O'Neil. Alabama, through 2 games against FBS teams, even though Florida State dominated them, still has a similar points per play margin, despite playing a much tougher strength of schedule. 0.353 points per play margin, which means for every one of Alabama's plays compared to every one of their opponent's plays, they score 0.353 more points. Alabama, they have Ryan Williams, they have Jeremy Bernard, they have Isaiah Horton. They also have Deontay Lawson at linebacker, and a ton of theoretically good players on defense and also offense. So when I look at Wisconsin's roster in comparison to theirs, Wisconsin, I think, has, Tackett Curtis, Christian Allegro. They have Corey Walker, who's a defensive end, but a defensive end worthy noting. And then you got Ricardo Hallman and Austin Brown at defensive back. Wisconsin has some players too. They have a good roster for sure. I think that they, as a team, might be a little underrated by especially Big Ten people who are just horrified from what they've seen in the Luke Fickell era so far. But there is a reason that Alabama is a 3.5 touchdown favorite. The only path for Wisconsin to win this game, I think, is the path of mental fortitude. Alabama, we have seen this before, and this is not hating Alabama. It's just what we've seen. They have a shaky mentality. They have shaky development. They have shaky discipline. How do you beat those teams when they have a massive talent edge over you? Well, you believe in yourself, you execute well enough to make it a close game, and then you try to shove the dagger in the heart late in the fourth quarter. And if it works, like Michigan over Ohio State last year. And if it doesn't work, like Nebraska almost beating Ohio State last year but failing, then you recognize the good effort from your players, as Matt Rule did, and you move on and you process it. That is how Wisconsin is going to win here, if they do. How solid is their identity? That is going to in part determine it. If the culture shift is real that Wisconsin says they have, and if they've already established or reestablished their identity, I like their chances here. If Alabama mentally is still angry, and on top of being angry, they respect Wisconsin as an opponent, then this will not be a fun day for Wisconsin. If they either are passive in general, or they're still angry, but they don't respect Wisconsin as an opponent, that's where the fun can begin for Wisconsin, metaphorically speaking. If you're an Alabama fan, of course, that is not where the fun begins, and you do not like that one bit. I think that rushing offense is going to be a key here. It's something Alabama has struggled at so far this year. It's also something that Wisconsin has had some struggles with, but not to the same degree as Alabama, I don't think, relative to expectations. Offensive line play, Wisconsin's had some of their worst offensive line play in recent memory, consistently snapping the ball high, which doesn't help the new quarterback Danny O'Neil. And Caden Proctor's not looked good, does not look like a first-round talent right now. He's getting blown off the ball. He's giving up pressure. Alabama's O-line looks like, once again, it's underperforming in a collegiate sense for really the nth year in a row, ever since it won that Joe Moore Award in 2020. Run defense, how large is Alabama's quarterback edge? And also special teams are some other factors that I think will determine a matchup of this caliber. I mention quarterback edge because I believe Ty Simpson, almost no matter what, is going to be the better quarterback in this game. But that does not mean that he will be the decisively better quarterback, because how much of a better quarterback he is really determines things here. Wisconsin is not running as quarterback-centric of an offense as Alabama is. If Ty Simpson comes out and Wisconsin has his number, and Danny O'Neal comes out and just plays well enough to move the football, that's very bad news for Alabama. And you'll tell that early. I think that within a quarter and a half, you will know whether or not Alabama blows Wisconsin out, or if this is going to be a one-score game in the fourth quarter. You'll know. I think a quarter and a half in. Because given what we've seen from Alabama under DeBoer, what we've seen from them this year, the fact that I think they lack in some fundamental soundness and development areas, and I think Wisconsin, based on their first two games, is much better defensively, especially in the trenches, than they have been in the prior 2 years. That's why they're running a 4-2-5 defense and not a 2-4-5-3-3-5. They have the personnel to run the four-down D line that Mike Tressel wants to, that Fickell knows they have to compete in the Big Ten. Then it's not like Wisconsin, unless they get big plays through the air, is going to pull away. Because if Wisconsin can hold their own in the run defense, and Simpson isn't playing an A or high B level game, I think Wisconsin's defense can hold its own water there. And then it comes down to the Alabama defense against the Wisconsin offense. And I think the style of game Jeff Grimes wants to play can match up fairly well against the style of defense that Kane Womack and Alabama are running. So that is an impactful question, an important question. I'm very anxious and curious to see what comes of Wisconsin's defense and also how Alabama approaches the game. If Alabama enters this thinking they deserve to essentially get Wisconsin on a silver platter, or they come out and they respect Wisconsin as an opponent to the degree that I don't know if they did Florida State, and they come out and they just win. Now, in saying that, I'm not saying that if they just respected Florida State, they win. I don't think that. Florida State had an amazing game plan. I think Florida State, to this point, is probably better than Wisconsin. But we don't quite know that yet. That's why I thought it was important to mention. I think that Wisconsin's going to be able to run the ball decently here, but not enough to compensate for Alabama probably defending the pass fairly well. Now, if Danny O'Neal has a good game somehow, or Billy Edwards comes in and is healthy and he plays a good game, Wisconsin has the receivers to where I think they can get some of Alabama's DBs. But that's a what if. So I'm going to go with Alabama strongly there. I also think that Wisconsin, I think they'll be able to stop the run from Alabama pretty effectively. But I don't think their DBs will be able to hold up against Jeremy Bernard, Ryan Williams, and some of the tight ends that Alabama has. And that plus home field advantage, I think Alabama having a better staff slightly, not much. I think these staffs are pretty equal, but I'd give the slightly into Alabama there. And the massive talent edge Alabama has makes me believe that Wisconsin is not going to have a fun time. I said to a friend that I think Alabama either blows Wisconsin out or Wisconsin pulls off the upset and nothing in between. So I'm going to go with Alabama pulling off the blowout, winning, and covering. I hope that it's more entertaining than that. Not saying I hope Alabama loses. Not saying I hope Wisconsin wins. Just saying, blowouts aren't really fun unless my team is involved. You all know who my team is. And even then, entertaining football is really what I love the most. Good, entertaining football. And given the caliber of team Alabama is and who Wisconsin is, a blowout here would not be indicative of two teams playing it hard and one team is just that much better, if you catch what I'm saying. I think Alabama crushes Wisconsin, though. There's too many talent disparities for Wisconsin to make up for realistically. If they do end up pulling off the upset, it's not because Wisconsin's better than Alabama in all likelihood. it's more likely because Wisconsin had the better game plan, they had the better staff, and Alabama has some severe issues that just didn't match up well with Wisconsin's roster. Okay, that's it. I gotta get going because I gotta hit the road actually in 40 minutes, and I want to get these videos out beforehand. So I will see you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Live show will be occurring Sunday. Not going to promise anything before that, but Sunday will be live next, and there will be other videos tomorrow. Not just these 8 that I produced, but there will be some other quick previews and maybe some additional content that will be released tomorrow too. Actually, we got football tonight. NC State against Wake. It'll be pretty fun. So I'll see you guys soon. Thank you for watching.